I'm an optimist because I think the Labour Party is doomed.
To get Brexit.
Make America great again.
No, no, no.
Hello, this is Steven Edington for The Sun, and today we're interviewing Douglas Carswell. Douglas Carswell is a former Conservative MP who in 2014 defected to UKIP, causing a huge tidal wave in British politics. He was then part of the Vote Leave campaign during the referendum. He has a keen interest in the digitalisation of politics and has written several books on various matters to do with politics and the digital economy. We're going to be talking about reforming the civil service, the BBC, and also about socialism and why young people are attracted to it. Douglas, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, let's talk about your past. You grew up in Uganda as a teenager. Why were you out there? When were you out there? And what kind of impact did it have on your perception of life?
Well, it was home for me. My parents moved out to Uganda in the early 60s, before I was born. I was born actually back in the UK. My mother came back to the UK for me to be born in the UK. But I grew up out there. It was home. And I lived out there, had a wonderful childhood, growing up out there till my late teens. My father was a doctor out there. So was my mother, actually. They were both doctors, although my mother tended to focus more on her great passion in life, which was bird watching. She was one of the leading ornithologists in that part of the world. And I had an idyllic childhood. Now, often when people talk about Uganda at that time, there were all sorts of political problems. There was a dictator, Idi Amin, then Milton Obote. There was a civil war. But actually, as a child growing up out there, I remember the good things. I remember a wonderful country with wonderful people and being very outdoorsy. It was a place where I could indulge my passion for natural history. I have very fond memories. In fact, I've been back recently. And the wonderful thing about Uganda is the troubles have stopped, the political instability's stopped, and it's absolutely thriving. I think it's growing at 5 or 6% per year, and it's prosperous, and it's still a wonderfully beautiful country.
You were out there when it was in poverty and there was lots of crisis going on. Can you talk a little bit about that and how it's adapted from being in such a low state to now having 5 or 6% GDP growth?
Well, it's quite extraordinary. When I was growing up out there was this backdrop of failure. It was a failed state. And without anyone ever giving me a lesson in economics, I could see just through a process of osmosis, of observation around me, how this had come about. The most entrepreneurial people in the country had been thrown out. The East African Asians had been deported. The borders had been closed because of high tariffs and protectionism. One of the dictators had decreed that it was illegal to sell coffee if you were a small coffee farmer, unless it was through the coffee marketing board. They nationalised the coffee industry. And so I could see all around me farms where small African farmers had once used this cash crop to provide for their families, couldn't do it any longer. So I saw with my own eyes growing up the effects of state control. And I think that made me instinctively wary of politicians being able to improve things. But the wonderful thing about that part of Africa in particular, but sub-Saharan Africa more generally, is how, particularly with digital technology, government has stepped out the way. People are able to buy and sell things using mobile phones and digital technology. And whoosh, you're seeing this incredible takeoff. In Britain, we think we've had a really good year if the economy grows at, 2.5%. In fact, if it gets to more than 2.5%, people start to talk about overheating. In Uganda, I think I'm right in saying it's projected over the next 5-10 years to grow at 6 or 7% a year. And since the early 1990s, Uganda has grown at 5-6% per year. And it's produced this incredible, prosperous, middle-class group of largely urban Africans. And they're doing incredibly well. So, I think it's very good proof, if further proof were needed, that when Adam Smith all those years ago recognised that the free market and the invisible hand was the secret to the wealth of nations, he was absolutely spot on.
You really grew up in a unique opportunity to see that change and that kind of the economics of what one might call socialism or state intervention into the economy and its market. And young people like me today haven't seen that. I've grown up in Britain all my life, and most young people think that socialism is a good thing. Most young people vote for Jeremy Corbyn to be Prime Minister. Yet most young people even talk about communism as a positive thing. Why is that? And how can we change that? How can we get into voters' minds that perhaps socialism and socialist ideas aren't the way forward?
Well, having left what you might call party politics. Since winning the referendum, I've sort of moved on completely from all of that. One thing that I am very concerned about is exactly this point. It's the broader question of what you might call the Overton window. This is the notion that within a society there is a open window within which the political debate can take place. And my fear is that actually in recent years, because people have had no direct experience of socialism and its malevolent effects, the Overton window has moved in the direction of Corbynism and this sort of lazy thinking that actually socialism is somehow good. Now, how do we counter that? How do we show people, without exposing them to the horrors of socialism, that actually you really don't want to have politicians controlling your lives for you? There's an irony, isn't there, where you get a generation of people who will, they'll sit in a coffee shop, they'll drink, coffee grown in Ethiopia. They'll use a mobile phone that has a supply chain that, means it was designed in America. It uses chips from Korea and it was assembled in China and has software from India. And yet they're encouraged to think that trade is somehow inherently exploitative. This is something that I think it's not their fault. It's the fault of people like me, free marketeers in this country. We've been lazy. If I'm frank, for the past 30 years, we haven't made the moral case for the free market. We've argued about the free market in case in terms of utility. We've talked about how it will add percentage points to GDP. What we need to do is to make again and afresh the moral case for the free market. The free market is the most moral economic system that has ever been created, precisely because it helps the poorest people the most. People at the apex of society, they'll do well under any system. It's ordinary folk who suffer most under socialism. If you create rent controls in London, it won't be the big landlords who suffer. It'll be poor families who'll have nowhere to live. If you regulate free exchange between countries, it won't be the rich elite who will find ways of evading those controls. It'll be ordinary people who suddenly find that actually the price of everyday things in shops goes up. So we need to find a way of making the moral case for the free market. And I think we need to do it fairly urgently. We don't want to be going into a general election with another left-wing lunatic offering more socialism.
I think their trump card is inequality. That's their kind of go-to word as to why they really believe that socialism is the way forward. And they've got a point, haven't they? I mean, you've got thousands and thousands of people in Britain, or millions of people in Britain, whose wealth is equated to a very, very small amount of people who own huge amounts of capital. Now, that can't be right in a society, can it?
In my view, having stood for election successfully in Clacton with some of the poorest communities in Britain, I was elected on 4 occasions, 2 different parties. I never lost an election in that part of Essex. I've come to the conclusion that actually this obsession with inequality is an obsession of the elites. It's often people, no disrespect, I'm sure it doesn't apply to you and your colleagues, but often it'll be journalists who perhaps find they're a little bit downwardly socially mobile. They maybe can't afford the best restaurants in London and they slightly resent the hedge fund manager who can. And they've got it into their heads that actually there's this great problem with inequality. I don't think most people in Britain see it that way. I think most people in Britain don't compare themselves to hedge fund managers who've done phenomenally well or the occasional Russian plutocrat who owns a house in Knightsbridge. Most people see it in terms of, can they get the things for their family that they want? And I don't think there is a problem with inequality in this country when it comes to those sorts of things. I mean, on the abstract, think of a country like China. China 50 years ago had very, very, very low levels of inequality. Pretty much everyone in China was dirt poor. Today in China, there is enormous inequality. There are more billionaires in China than there are now, I think I'm right in saying, in Europe and perhaps even in America. And yet, would you rather live as a Chinese person in China today or the China of 50 years ago? Without question, China today is a better place, even for the poorest of Chinese, than China was even 20 years ago. So provided you don't actually take away opportunities from the poorest, provided they have the opportunities, I don't see that actually there's a problem with how well the people at the top are doing. Surely when a man like, I don't know, take for example the late great Steve Jobs or Bill Gates, every time I've bought an iPhone, and I've bought one I think on 2 or 3 occasions in my life, I have enriched the owners of Apple marginally. They've benefited in terms of the profit margin probably by a few dozen, maybe even $100 or so. But think of what they've done to my life. Think of how they've enriched my life. So the socialists have a problem with successful entrepreneurs, people like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and all the other entrepreneurs that we can think of. But actually, I think ordinary folk, if they have seen how that entrepreneur has created a product that has improved the quality of their lives, whether it's running a Amazon that ensures they get the products they want at the cheapest price, or whether it's providing them with a budget airline that means they can take their families on cheap holidays, provided that the person who's made a great deal of money has done it by providing people with a product that they're willing to pay for, I think most people actually think fair dues to them. Thank goodness we have those entrepreneurs, because if we didn't have those entrepreneurs, we'd be worse off.
I think you touched on there the kind of politics of jealousy argument. I mean, talking about certain journalists, I don't think myself, who may think that, as you say, their lives are slightly worse off than those who are really very successful and therefore make those arguments. How do we tackle the politics of jealousy argument? Because they would say we're not jealous, we simply want those who are poorer to have more money, and those who are rich, they've got plenty of money, they don't need billions and billions of pounds in the bank.
I think you've always got to be a little bit sceptical about people, particularly those seeking public office, who play the I'm being virtuous on behalf of other people card. I can't help noticing that often there's quite a big level of hypocrisy. People, particularly in the Labour Party, on the Labour left, will invoke this sort of supposedly superior morality, but actually, do they apply those lessons themselves? Do they not themselves live at public expense? What businesses have they run? What entrepreneurship is it that they have some great insight into? Look, I think the people who have done more to enrich my former constituents are the people who run and work in organisations like Tesco. They provide mums and dads who've got to clothe and feed a family with cheap, affordable school uniform. They're the sort of people who run low-cost budget airlines. They provide ordinary people in this country with cheap, affordable holidays. Growing up 20, 30 years ago, there was a phrase, the jet set, and it implied that people who were rich enough to travel on aeroplanes regularly were part of this sort of global wealthy elite. It's thanks to big corporations and airline entrepreneurs that we've all been able to join the jet set. So I think we've actually got to take this argument head on, question the motives of those who virtue signal their own morality by trying to expropriate the wealth of others, and constantly reinforce this point that actually, it's not politicians who have given ordinary folk more opportunities in life. On the contrary, politicians have tended to deny ordinary people those opportunities. The people who've actually given ordinary folk the greatest opportunities are people who've created and invented things that ordinary folk want.
Do you know what I find absolutely fascinating is that I, as a young kind of British person, has basically been brought up to believe in the state-educated system, that almost our history doesn't matter, and that the things in the past, like our institutions, our great institutions of monarchy or of our parliamentary system or of sovereignty of the individual, these great English ideas, these British values, that they're somehow irrelevant. And that basically the world started, I don't know, maybe let's say in the 18th and 19th century when the Industrial Revolution happened, and it was just progress from there. We scrapped all the institutions, especially religion. I think that's the biggest one they've really gone after. And that basically everything that's happened in British and world history is essentially irrelevant, because now the new age of progressivism has come in. I think that people, when talking about socialist ideas and when talking about capitalist ideas and the free market, history is so important.
Absolutely.
And making sure that people can understand what has happened in the past in these communist socialist countries and what's happened in these countries.
Historic relativism, which is what you've eloquently described, is very much related to that other great cardinal fallacy of the politically correct left, cultural relativism. And I think it's pretty easy within the space of 2 minutes to demonstrate how nonsensical they are. If you believe that all cultures are the same and that you believe in historic relativism, ask yourself this fundamental question. Imagine that the world we lived in today was shaped not by the triumph of what are largely Western values and the success of the Anglo-American project, but imagine that if, in the great struggles of the past, the other side had won. How do you imagine the world might look today if the other side had won the Cold War? How do you imagine the world would look today if in 1941 the Nazis had prevailed rather than the forces of liberal democracy? What would the world look like if Prussian autocracy had prevailed in 1918 rather than the Anglo-American powers. You've only got to ask that question to realise that actually the world is a benevolent place precisely because the right side and the right values and the right principles have endured. Now, when people argue that there's some sort of historic relativism and cultural relativism, I think they miss out on this huge point. Another great danger of historic relativism and cultural relativism is it tends to reduce our country, the United Kingdom, or in America's case, the United States, just simply being a collection of people, a random assortment of people that happen to be living within a border. I say no. Actually, a nation is based on shared principles and shared ideals and shared values. And these values have long historic origins. And if you believe you can recreate your nation based on a year zero, based on complete rationalism without reference to the past, you end up doing what the poor French have done. They're on, I think, their fifth republic now since they've been trying to do this. It's not a great way of running a country.
I want to understand why that is. Why is this postmodernist thinking, why has it become so popular among young people? And some people would look at the universities, perhaps it's the lecturers who are sort of teaching them this, or is it somewhere else?
I think part of it's conceit. If you look in the United States, for example, the current trend at the moment within the United States to deny the principles of the American Constitution as being timeless truths, it doesn't just start today. I mean, the New York Times, for example, is running this extraordinary project, which is, I think, pretty awful, the 1619 Project, which denies that the history of the American Republic is a story of liberty. It claims, on the contrary, that the United States Republic and the story of the United States Republic is defined by exploitation. But it doesn't just start in 1960s university campuses. If you go right back to the time of Woodrow Wilson, they were denying that the inalienable truths within the American Constitution were indeed truths, were indeed inalienable. So I think the problem is that clever people, unfortunately, tend to be rather conceited. They tend to think that if only clever people like them were in charge of society, all would be well. But unfortunately, the history is that history shows that if you allow a conceited intellectual elite to try to run society, they do it badly. They do it badly in all sorts of micro ways. They build tower blocks in the London skyline that become fairly hellish places to live. They run central banks that tank the economy. They do all sorts of foolish public policy things. But at a more fundamental level, I think they try to deny ordinary folk a sense of national belonging. I don't think national belonging and national identity and patriotism are dirty words. I think that people who try to show their supposed intellectual sophistication by denigrating these things actually show the fact that they are cheapskates and intellectual charlatans. I think it's profoundly important that people have a sense of identity and a sense of history, and that they have the humility to recognise that our forebears had a wisdom that our current leadership sometimes lacks.
Haven't they got a point in that we should be ashamed of parts of our history? The slavery, for example, Britain had a big part in the slave trade originally. You could look at towards our colonial empire and kind of in India, the famines over there that were a big part of our history. Haven't they got a point in that we should be ashamed of our past?
There are lots and lots of things this country has done and the rulers of this country have done that are, if we were to judge them by contemporary standards, pretty outrageous. And let's not just pretend this was the rulers. I think ordinary folk in this country several hundred years ago would have had a set of values that most people would have found pretty objectionable. Cruelty to animals, for example, the inequality shown towards women. All sorts of things about the world have got better. But let's also be clear that the principles of equality under the law, of liberty, of consent of the governed, these essentially Anglo-American values and principles emanated from Britain and America. And yes, there were many, many times when both people in Britain and the rulers of America failed to live up to those principles. But that reflects badly on them. It doesn't reflect badly on these principles. Take, for example, the United States, for example. The Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson, famously declared that all men were created equal. Yet people often point out that Jefferson hypocritically owned slaves. I would just say a couple of things to that. First of all, at the time of the Declaration of Independence, slavery was pretty much ubiquitous and had been throughout human history in pretty much every society. Secondly, I would say that the founding fathers, not Jefferson, but many of the other founding fathers, were passionate abolitionists and wanted to abolish it and were campaigning to abolish it, men like Hamilton and Samuel and John Adams. Thirdly, I would say that many of the founding fathers were keen to create a constitution that would replace the failed Articles of Confederation. So they were willing to, if you like, ignore what they regarded as a great stain on America, this idea of slavery. And of course, we now know that they weren't able to ignore it because of the advent of intensive cotton farming. Slavery took off, it had a new lease of life, and eventually you get this titanic struggle between the forces of what you might call those who believed in the genuine principles and the application of those founding principles versus those who didn't. But ask yourself this question: it was the Anglo-American world that eliminated slavery. It was Americans who fought to eliminate slavery in America. It was Britain that abolished the slave trade, I think I'm right in saying, in 1807. It was Britain that abolished the slave trade within the British Empire, I think I'm right in saying, in the 1830s. The failure of people in America and Britain to live up to those principles, as I said before, doesn't take anything away from those principles. It shows that actually we're governed by people who are deeply imperfect.
Now, you've touched on there a couple of things that we should be proud of as Western countries. When I was in school, and that was only just a few years ago in state school, I would learn about the atrocities of the British Empire. I would learn about the awful Battle of the Somme, for example, or whatever, or in India, these terrible, terrible atrocities.
The Bengal famine and the Opium Wars.
Exactly.
For sure.
And it really instills into your mind that it is something to be ashamed of to become from this country. But the question is this: what should we be proud of? Because there are loads of things. I mean, and I'm having to unfortunately do this outside of school. Go back and read different parts of history. I'm currently reading a book on Churchill, and there is so much to be proud of as a country. And I want you to talk a bit about that.
First of all, don't presume that those things that we don't like, the imposition of empire, the formalization of control in India, the activities of the East India Company, don't presume that there weren't people in this country who were at the time passionately against that. The Liberals under Gladstone were fiercely against that scoundrel Disraeli who played the imperial card in order to do something that they would have regarded as profoundly un-British when he created this idea of a formalized empire with the Queen as the Empress of India. It was a British Parliament that impeached Warren Hastings. It was people in Britain who recoiled at this idea that we would do something that we thought only colonial powers in Europe would do, which is to try to seek dominion over others. In fact, I think the most striking thing about Britain's acquisition of empire in the 19th century, I'm not talking about that earlier stage of colonial settlements in Americas, I'm talking about the what you might call the Second British Empire. What I think is most striking about it is the reluctance of Britain to actually formalise control. If you go back and study the historic record, countless decision makers in London were incredibly reluctant to formalise control of territory in Africa. They were being lobbied to do it by missionaries who said we've got to get in there, or the Germans or the French or whoever will get there first. There's an argument, I think, to say that actually the acquisition of a lot of empire was slow and done in a fit of absence of mind, to use one of the scholars' great phrases. Every successful country that I can think of, from the Roman Republic to the Dutch Republic to the Venetian Republic to Britain, was a great commercial republic, and it became an empire. It started to formally acquire territory, and this movement from republic to empire was a common trait from Rome, for the Venetians, for the Dutch, and for the British. I think one of the wonderful things about the American system today is how America has stayed true to its republican principles. Despite being the world's great power for the past 60 years, it's resolutely refused to follow the road of corruption that those other great republics followed. I include England after the Glorious Revolution as if you like, a republic with a monarch, if that's not a complete oxymoron. So I actually, I think there's a lot for us to be proud of. I think the Anglo-American powers over the past couple of 100 years have done a huge amount to elevate the condition of humankind. That's not to say that Lyndon Johnson didn't make mistakes with his foreign policy. That's not to claim that American foreign policy and American domestic policy, the Jim Crow laws, weren't appalling abominations. But it's always been America and Britain that I think have been at the driving force for greater equality and the elevation of the human condition.
And perhaps the starting point for reversing this kind of tide of the idea that socialism and communism even are good ideas is to understand an objective, full history where we are proud of our language, we are proud of our culture, we're proud of our economic system that has brought so many people out of poverty, we're proud of our literature and of our movies and everything that Britain encompasses and those British values. Let's talk about the Labour leadership election, because this is the key element, if you were, in 5 years' time, where you've got all these young socialists. Are they going to grow up and continue to vote Labour? And is Boris going to, or the next Conservative Prime Minister going to lose the election because we've got a ticking time bomb on our hands? So let's talk about the Labour leadership election. Do you see anyone who can inspire voters? I mean, what kind of candidates?
I'm an optimist because I think the Labour Party is doomed. They have a motley crew collection of weirdos vying to be the next leader. And I mean, let's just stop and look at some of them. Some of them I wouldn't trust to run a bath, let alone a political party. Heaven forbid that they should ever get to run a country. But aside from some of what you might call the quality control issues, there are some rather interesting candidates standing to be leader. Just look at the existential problem that the left in this country faces. The Labour Party was formed in order to stand up for the interests of organised labour. The organised labour movement came along and they needed a party to represent them. I would argue that profound social and economic changes of the past quarter of a century mean that the need for organised labour has gone. Digital, in a weird way, fulfills Marx's idea about the workers owning the means of production. The idea that you need to be part of a mass collective movement to engage in the labour market or you'll be exploited by a wicked capitalist, it's nonsense. So what is the Labour Party for if it's not for the interests of organised labour? It was based under Blair on this conceit that a small technocratic elite could organise society from the top down better than we could organise it organically and spontaneously for ourselves. But I think digital is exposing that to be a fallacy. The idea that we're better off by deferring to remote elites to make decisions. I think that was one of the reasons why I think people rejected being part of the European project. So what is the left standing for? It's left advocating this invidious notion of identity politics, which frankly I think many people in the country find, if they can comprehend it at all, find it incredibly objectionable. If the Labour Party in this country wants to basically become a vehicle for every politically correct leftist canard of the day, it'll get a lot of retweets on Twitter, but it's not going to win over the support of suburban Britain. Now, there are millions of people in this country who would like political representation, but a political party that prioritises gender-neutral toilets is not going to get their support, I'm afraid. They're out of touch culturally. So, I mean, I think it's most likely that Keir Starmer will probably be the next leader of the Labour Party. And I think, imagine a scenario when he became that. This, I think, would neatly illustrate the left's fundamental problem. He would be the repository of every failed leftist orthodoxy. He would see the world from the point of view of a Remain-supporting quangocrat who couldn't believe that people would be so foolish as to recognise they couldn't cope without him organising their lives for them. I think if the Labour Party chooses someone like that, a sort of an heir to Blair's successor, they're in for a rude awakening. The Labour Party is fundamentally out of touch with its traditional support base. And yes, it may have the support of 500,000 excitable public sector workers in certain areas and university professions and university campuses, but it's not going to win many seats with that.
So there's not much to worry about, you don't think, with the next?
Well, I think the problem is for the Boris government. What do they do? It's very easy to drop the ball in politics. There's that old thing of oppositions don't win elections, governments lose them. I think in order to make sure that the Labour Party doesn't come close to gaining power, Boris mustn't drop the ball. And I think there are therefore certain things he has to do. And actually, I think they're more difficult to do than people might imagine. In 1979, you had a reformist Conservative administration elected, Margaret Thatcher. It introduced some profoundly big changes to the country, and it recognised, I think Thatcher's Tory party recognised that there were various vested interests that needed taking on, and it took them on. There's a different set of vested interests now, but I think if the Conservative Party doesn't turn this into a 79 moment and take on those vested interests, it will find that it is in the tradition of Cameron and Heath. It becomes a technocratic managerialist administration. In order to survive, it needs to take on those vested interests. It's not the Mandarinate. It's not the NUM, by the way, who I think are this country's problems. It's the Mandarinate. It's the official quangocracy in this country who presume that it is their right to make public policy. They've run this country almost regardless of who holds office for the past 20, 30 years. And they've run the country very badly. And I think we now need to take back control.
So we have a civil service, and that's, I think, who you're basically talking about there, who, as you say, make these important decisions. Supposedly they're meant to be made by the politicians who are elected by the people. However, we've seen a scenario, and I think the last few years with Brexit and the negotiations has really shone a light on this, where civil servants have been taking a lead and rather than the politicians taking the lead. So let's talk about the history of that. Now, there's that famous programme, Yes Minister, I think it's from the 80s, where it basically showed as a comedy about the civil service, where civil servants would run rings around the politicians. It was very funny at the time. And a lot of people said this was the most accurate documentary of the British government and how it works. What can Boris do to change the civil service? And what's the history behind this kind of technocracy in Britain?
Well, there's a tendency in all democracies for people in office to defer to technocrats, to groups of experts. You see it with chancellors saying that they're going to leave it to the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England to decide interest rates. You see successive education secretaries saying they're going to have a committee of quangocrats deciding what's in the national curriculum. But the one thing we know about unaccountable quangocrats is they always end up basically being guardianistas. They always end up pursuing an inherently leftist agenda. And we see this time and time again. Civil servants and the broader quangocracy presuming to make public policy, cowardly pygmy politicians holding ministerial office, not getting to grips with their department, being terrified of contradicting the official advice they're given. And you end up in a situation where whichever small clique of politicians sits on the sofa in Downing Street, the same basic people in the same British apparatus institutions making the same public policy irrespective. This is why I think many people got fed up with politicians from Blair to Gordon Brown to Cameron to Clegg. They basically saw little difference between them. It's not just that it means that those you elect are insulated from the views of the voters. It allows the elite to pursue their conceits unchecked and unguarded. It creates, I think, a mood of populism. People think, you might as well vote for a freak show because surely something's better than this cast of official politicians. But you also end up just with bad public policy making. By leaving it to central bankers to set interest rates, they tanked the banks. They created the biggest financial disaster that the world had seen since the creation of the modern currency system in 1971. By leaving it to small groups of officials to decide things, we don't actually get disinterested experts making good public policy. We end up normally with a series of public policy disasters and no one being held to account. So I think you need far-reaching reform. I think the key word is accountability. The civil service is basically run along a series of assumptions that are outdated. One of those assumptions is that the minister who might be notionally in charge of a department of tens of thousands of people can be accountable for all the decisions made in that department. And that's simply not the case. So we need to make civil servants individually far more accountable. We need to make sure that civil servants are accountable not just in the sense that when they get things wrong they can be fired, but that they're in the job for the term of a parliament. If you're a civil servant and you make a decision and then after 18 months you move on to another job and the error of that decision only becomes apparent 2, 3, 4 years after you've left, there's no meaningful accountability. So we need civil servants to be in position for much longer. We also need to get rid of this fallacy that civil servants have to be people who are good at sitting civil service fast stream exams 20 years ago. There are all sorts of public policy challenges where we could bring in people with real expertise who weren't civil servants 20 years ago, but have actually been doing other things in the real world. We could bring them into the civil service for a fixed term mandate to deliver things with accountability, money and leadership. Other countries do this and do this rather well. It's also, I think, pretty essential that the people at the centre of government, by which I mean Downing Street, the Cabinet Office and the Treasury, aren't operating any longer in that fractured system. You need a cohesive centre so that the people who are ultimately responsible, the people who work for the Prime Minister, the Prime Minister himself, actually is able to get a grip over the machinery of the state. All reformist governments in my adult lifetime have come to office trying to effect change. Blair did it, huge parliamentary majority. After 2 years of his complaining about his frustrations, the scars on his back, he called them. He was unable to effect change. Cameron, despite being in coalition with the Lib Dems, he had a big majority in Parliament for his so-called big society agenda. Whatever happened to that? We need to make sure that Boris can convert his 80-strong parliamentary majority into change in the way the country's run, and that requires rewiring the machinery of the state so that there's a cohesive strategic centre, there's accountability of the civil servants, and like most people in most walks of life, civil servants realise that actually if they make mistakes, it's on them.
I think saying the word civil servant probably turns a lot of people off. Most people probably wouldn't care about this issue. But it is really important, and let's talk about why it's important. These are the people that have to enact government policy. What does that mean? It means you as a voter who voted for the Conservative Party and for their manifesto, entrust your trust, as it were, into these people to deliver that. In other words, those are the people who actually are out there, the monkey grinders, doing government policy. And if they fail to do government policy, why is that? Is it on the minister or is it on them? So it's, as you say, it's about accountability to these people who are so important to public life.
I think you should start with an even more basic assumption. At the moment, when someone's appointed to be a minister, say you're the Home Secretary, what are your priorities? I think we should learn from other countries. In Australia, for example, if you are a minister, you are given by the Prime Minister what's known as a charter letter. And it says, this is what I am expecting you as the Home Secretary to do. Bang, 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 bang.
Like a job description.
A job description. I want you to reduce immigration from X to Y. I want you to get a grip of our borders by bringing in a system of technology and control, blah, blah, blah. You actually know what it is, and the minister knows what it is they're meant to do. At the moment, you get someone appointed, and people will say, this person, they're a big beast. They'll do a great job. By what criteria will they do a great job? If every cabinet minister was issued with a clear annual letter by the Prime Minister outlining what it is they're expected to do, that's the first start to meaningful accountability. At the moment, we have a political system where if a minister's no good, and I've met one or two who everyone in Whitehall and Westminster knew to be absolutely no good, the entire system is dedicated to trying to conceal their failings. Their party uses the tribal drum to conceal their failings by cheering them when they speak in the House of Commons rather than exposing them for being the hopeless non-entities that they are. And the civil servants around them issue press releases and initiatives to try to conceal their multiple public policy failings. Wouldn't it be good if we could have a system where actually, if you were no good and you were a member of the blue team, it was your own blue team that exposed your inadequacies and replaced you with someone who could do better?
Absolutely. So how do we get to this accountability? How do we get to a point where civil servants and ministers are accountable to the people? What are the key reforms? I know that you've mentioned in the past, for example, in America, they have this sort of Senate inquiry into new appointees, maybe something like that. Or are there other?
I wouldn't go as far as the American system. In America, you're right. If you are an official appointed to a federal agency or a federal department, what tends to happen is that you get nominated by the president and you then appear before the Senate or a committee of the Senate. And frankly, if they don't like you, if they think you're not up to it, they veto you. I wouldn't go that far. And I wouldn't go that far for a number of reasons. What I would do instead is a step towards that. I would issue a charter letter to each cabinet minister stipulating from the Prime Minister what it was I wanted that minister to do. I would list the policy priorities and I would then name the top civil servant team that were going to help you to get it done over the next 4 or 5 years. And I would expect them to be in that post for the next 4 or 5 years. And I think if you did that, very quickly, if a minister was to discover that actually the civil servants around them weren't up to it, they would be pretty keen to make that known and do something about it. And equally, if the civil servants discovered that the minister wasn't up to it, they would no longer conceal the fact from Parliament and the Prime Minister and the public. You would get accountability, but the key is to make sure that there are good people in the civil service. There are very capable people in the civil service, particularly the non-permanent secretary levels of the civil servants are full of good people. But to ensure that those good people are able to do good things, you need to fundamentally change the system of accountability. At the moment, you've created a system where too many civil servants are fundamentally interested in appearing to be effective rather than competent day-to-day project management. That's another thing we could learn. A country like Singapore, done phenomenally well economically and in all sorts of ways over the past few decades. If you're a civil servant in Singapore, there's something called the Civil Service Staff College. And if you are expected as a civil servant in Singapore to manage contracts, you have to go and do a contracts exam. If you were to reach the level of our equivalent of a permanent secretary, you would be expected to have taken a basic exam in financial and management and commercial competence. And frankly, I think if you were to get a lot of top British civil servants to sit those civil service exams in Singapore, even quite junior civil service exams in Singapore, you would reveal the extent to which our civil servants are not always as good. They're certainly not the Rolls-Royce civil service that they like to pretend they are.
This is a really interesting topic because Dominic Cummings, Boris Johnson's sort of chief aide, has talked a lot about this in the past and now, and it's sort of riling up a lot of journalists, so it's a great thing to talk about. Let's move on to the digital revolution. Now, I know this is something you have a particular interest in. You've written the book iDemocracy, probably before its time. But today we're in a studio in London and we're doing this on YouTube. Kind of 20 years ago, this would only be the BBC, this would only be ITV. What kind of effect has digital had on politics? And how do you see that adapting and developing in the future?
It's massive and it's wonderful. There's a broadcasting revolution underway. And by the way, well done for doing this. You said that if this was done 10 years ago, it would have been done by the BBC. Let me tell you something. The BBC would never allow this sort of long-form discussion because every time I ever did, in the 12 years that I was an MP, an interview with the BBC, I would constantly have gotcha questions thrown at me. So I could never expand on points that actually the viewer might be interested in. The broadcasting revolution that we're undergoing means that organisations such as yours, people like you, can have long-form discussions, which means that actually people like me can have our arguments teased out. We can be questioned in detail. People might agree with what I'm going to say, they might disagree with what I'm going to say, but there's none of that gotcha nonsense that forces most politicians to clam up. If you've ever watched an episode of, people say Andrew Neil, he's the best the BBC's got. Yeah, I'm sure he is. That's the problem. Full of gotcha moments. I've been interviewed by Andrew Neil many, many times, and I've never felt able to actually say what I felt because you're constantly on the defensive, waiting for that low-lying gotcha question, which is going to be used to discredit everything else you might have to say. I think what you're doing is really important. What you're doing is showing that opinion forming in politics can be democratized. We no longer have to leave it to the producer of the Today programme and the Guardianista elite to decide what we can and can't talk about politically. When I wrote a book, The End of Politics and the Birth of Our Democracy, a few years ago, I was convinced that digital media would allow me as a candidate to communicate directly with voters and if necessary, run de facto as an independent and win. And I kind of put this to the test, and I won. I won my seat in a by-election, one of the largest swings to any party in British political history. I then held my seat in a general election, something that many of those who changed parties in the last parliament proved unable to do. So I think I got this sense of how digital can be used. During the referendum, I think the Leave side used digital very, very effectively. You yourself have run some incredibly effective digital political campaigns. And I think people still haven't quite cottoned on the extent to which this digital disruption is going to change politics. If you can do politics without the BBC commentariat and politics without a political party, I think actually you're going to see some wonderful things. You're going to see the democratisation not only of opinion forming, you're going to see more independence. I look at the state of London politics today. I would love it if there was a really good, and I'm not having a go at Khan or Sean Bailey, they're both good people. But wouldn't it be lovely if London as a city also had a couple of really impressive independent standing? Digital would allow them to do that. I don't mean importing an ex-MP from the northwest of England. I mean, if a genuine Londoner stood as a credible independent, I think you could achieve some great stuff. Ken Livingstone managed to do this some years ago. I think we need more independence in politics, and I think digital is going to allow it. We need more unorthodox opinions, and I think digital is going to allow it. So I think it's wonderful.
It's interesting you mentioned Andrew Neil. In the last general election, obviously Andrew Neil did those leaders' interviews, and Boris, the Prime Minister, refused to do it. And this caused a big fuss with the Guardianista types, and it got 5 million clips of views on Twitter and whatever. And now Dominic Cummings is now even saying to ministers to boycott the Today programme, which would have been unheard of in, let's say, Thatcher's time, for example.
Well, politics is dominated in this country by a series of cartels, and Dominic Cummings is starting to take those on. I mean, one of the first cartels, even before that, is what you might call the SPAD, the Special Advisor Cartel. For years and years and years, to become a SPAD was a sort of, you needed to have the right contacts, insider information, and to recycle all the old failed.
Can you just explain what a SPAD is?
It's a special advisor. They are the ministerial bag carriers, the most junior people in politics. Under the old system, what would tend to happen is if you wanted to become a front bench politician, you would become a SPAD, a special advisor. Cameron became one when he was young. The Miliband brothers became one when they were young. Ed Balls became one when they were young. Nick Clegg became one when they were young. I think I've just described the problem. Those sorts of people dominated politics because they became a SPAD, a special advisor, and it allowed them to get parachuted into a safe seat. Dom Cummings just put out a blog saying he wanted anyone with any ideas to write to him directly if they wanted to become a SPAD. He's busted open that cartel, and I think it's absolutely wonderful. Another cartel that's been busted open is the political lobby correspondent cartel. It's actually an organised cartel. The House of Commons authorities had colluded with the press lobby to issue passes to only a few privileged journalists who were lobby correspondents. This meant that good bloggers who actually might want to, expose the expense scandal rather than have lunch with the ministers and MPs responsible for it, who might actually want to highlight some of the failings of the parliamentary system rather than brush the failings under the carpet and turn a blind eye. The lobby was about excluding alternative media sources. And again, what this government has done, it's opened up the press lobby. And of course, the lobby correspondents hate it. They're paid to have privileged connections with Downing Street spokesmen. Downing Street would brief them as journalists. They would then interpret that how they wanted and write the next day's headlines. What we discovered is actually they wrote the next day's headlines based on their own preconceptions. Now that the government is allowing you and me and 60 million people in this country to see those briefings for ourselves, not only can we get a better understanding of what the government's actually saying, we don't have to rely on fraudcasters in the news to present their own views as an interpretation of what it is that the government is doing. It's cut them out. It's another cartel busted open. Now, of course, lobby correspondents hate this, but if we have a system of democracy where anyone in this country with good ideas can contribute to the making of government policy by becoming a SPAD, you don't just need to be a sort of Oxbridge wannabe to get one. Anyone can form an opinion about what it is that the government's trying to do. It'll upset people in the cartels in Westminster, but a good thing too.
I want to talk about the BBC because this is such a huge British institution.
They're the biggest cartel of the lot, aren't
they? Right, exactly. And can you just explain, I mean, Dominic Cummings, for example, let's say this is their policy, the government's policy, or it's soon to be the government's policy. They're going to end the decriminalisation of the licence fee. In other words, at the moment, if you don't pay your licence fee, you are essentially committing a crime. They're going to end that. Now, that's a really interesting policy because it's not directly attacking the BBC. It's not directly saying we're going to take away the licence fee, but it's simply ending the decriminalisation of it. What do you think about that?
I think it's fair. I mean, one of the saddest moments I ever had as a Member of Parliament would be meeting with desperate constituents. They're almost always single mums, by the way, who hadn't paid their licence fee, frankly, because they couldn't afford it. And they couldn't afford it for totally understandable reasons, because food and heating were bigger priorities, who were persecuted by a machine that wanted them to pay the licence fee and would take them to a magistrate's court and criminalise them for not being able to pay. Can you imagine if Netflix or Spotify would give you a criminal record for not paying your subs? Now, I've missed some of my Spotify subs, I've missed some of my Netflix subs, and you know what happens? They just cut me off. Why don't we have the same system for the BBC? It should be a subscription-based service. You pay for it because you want to, and if you don't pay it, they cut you off. At worst, it should be a civil case. They should, like non-payment of the electricity bill, they should chase you through the courts as a civil matter. It cannot be right that it is a criminal matter for not paying for the BBC's output. Now, the fact that this is even a point of dispute and contention tells me that actually there is something profoundly wrong and morally bankrupt with our intellectual and cultural elites propped up primarily by the BBC. Here is an organisation that gets £3.2 billion of public money taken off ordinary people on pain of going to prison, and it is used not only to ignore the iniquity of the system that enriches them so, it is used to allow a tiny minority of people to present in our living rooms their opinions as the news, and it has also created a cartel on softer cultural issues. The BBC operates an incredibly cliquey commissioning system, so that in order to get commissioned for comedy, you have to almost by definition subscribe to the failed leftist orthodoxies. Satire is anything but. You've got tired old shows like Have I Got News For You, which purport to be about current affairs, but reflect sort of failed views by failed comedians from 20 years ago. It's fundamentally rotten. It's fundamentally bankrupt. And we have to pay for it. What the Conservatives are going to do is not try to create a new architecture. It's simply to allow people to opt out. If I no longer had to pay the BBC licence fee, what is it a month? It's 140 quid a year. Divide that by 12. You know, it's more than my Spotify subscription. It's more than my Netflix subscription. If it was a matter of choice as to whether I paid it on a monthly basis, do you know what? I think I would subscribe to Amazon Prime instead. And do you know what? One day I hope Amazon Prime starts doing current affairs, because I think if people like you were allowed to do what for all our lives it's been left to Nick Robinson and Andrew Neil to do, I think we might start to have a more honest political debate in this country.
I want to talk about optimism. Over at The Sun, we're quite keen on optimism. We think
it's a rising sun, not a setting sun.
Exactly, that's a great analogy. Boris Johnson's just won the election last year, ended years of chaos. Many people were saying, you know, we've got this great optimism in our country. What are you optimistic about in 2020?
I'm optimistic about a lot. I mean, first of all, we're leaving the European Union. We're leaving the European Union, something I've spent my adult life campaigning for. And despite the calamity that was the May government, which meant that we left the European Union almost like a piece of luggage on the end of a conveyor belt, we almost sort of flopped off. Just in the nick of time, the British people intervened to correct that. We've elected Boris Johnson, one of the architects of the Leave vote, and I think, you know, we'll inject a suitable spirit of optimism into our departure. We want to be good friends with the EU. We want to have a good relationship with them after we've left. Barnier and co and Donald Tusk and co, I think, have made it rather difficult to do that. There's still an assumption that we're going to have to be friends with theirs on their terms rather than our own. I hope that the more sensible voices in Europe prevail. But you know what? The real game changer in all of this is the fact that we could cut a free trade agreement with the United States. If it proves that at the end of this year, the European Union at the end of that transition phase either insists that we remain chained to them by extending the transition deal, or insists that we accept terms that frankly treat us as a province, then, you know, we've got in our back pocket a deal with America. And I'm not talking about a deal with Donald Trump. Donald Trump may or may not be president of the United States in 12 months' time. He may or may not be replaced by someone better either in this year's elections or in 4 years' time. The United States is going to be our friend and our ally long before here today, gone tomorrow politicians in the White House are around. It is a great country. We've got a lot in common with it. If the European Union wants to impose on us a punitive trade agreement, we've got another alternative. I'm also optimistic about the fundamental, the political elite and the intellectual elite call it populism. But I think there's this moment of great awakening in this country. I think the deference in the political system has gone. The idea that people, just because they're paid public money to do something, know what's right for us, that idea is going. And I think actually this is a cause for great hope. Our forebearers made this country a great country because they didn't take at face value the claims of kings and courtiers. And I think that spirit of not deferring to authority, of not deferring to an elite, of constant relentless questioning, of, to use the phrase of, I think, the Royal Society, to take nothing at face value. I think that means that actually this country is going to undergo a great process of greater liberty. It's going to be a bad decade, the 2020s, for people who want to define themselves by holding power over others. I think it's going to be great for ordinary folk.
Douglas Carswell, thank you very much.